The next speaker will be Dr. Michel Goldman, Emeritus Professor and founder of the Institute for Interdisciplinary Innovation in Healthcare. He was the first executive director of the Innovative Medicines Initiative, funded jointly by the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and the associations of the European Commission, which launched private-public consortia in such critical areas as antimicrobial resistance, Alzheimer's, dementia, and drug safety. Dr. Goldman is the editor-in-chief of Frontiers in Medicine and a board member of the French National Institute of Health and Medical Research, or INSERM. He also serves as a member of the Cancer Mission Assembly of the European Commission and is president of the Belgium AstraZeneca Foundation. Dr. Goldman was awarded the Lucien Steinberg Prize in 1997, the Quinquennial Prize of the Belgian National Fund of Scientific Research in 2000, and in 2007 received the degree of Doctor Honoris Causa at the Université de Lille.
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for the invitation. I feel a bit uncomfortable because I'm not an economist. I'm not a specialist of gene therapy. Actually, I am an immunologist by training. But for 5 years, I was the executive director of actually the European Public-Private Partnership to promote innovation in medicine. And after that, I went back to academia, where I created this Institute for Interdisciplinary Innovation, working with economists and other disciplines. And it's true that one of our important research areas is indeed gene therapy prices. And we were fortunate to collaborate with Alain Fischer, who, as you know, is a pioneer of gene therapy. And what I will do today is to share with you some of our thoughts about what could be a reasonable pricing for these gene therapies, thinking that they are part of the important tools that we have in healthcare to promote, to foster the common good. And I hope that this short talk will be quite complementary to the previous one, which I think was very articulated and very clear to understand the different processes leading to the coverage of gene therapies by our healthcare system. My talk will probably be a bit more provocative. The idea is the following. I think that too often we just agree and follow what the gene therapy manufacturers are telling us without challenging them enough about the prices they propose for their products. And this will be, I would say, the general theme of my presentation. May I have the next slide, please? So I think this slide is not really useful. You know that there has been really a wonderful and impressive development of gene therapies for a number of diseases over the years. The point I would like to make, and which was already illustrated in this interesting symposium, is that progressively we move from rare or very rare disease, such as, you know, the very first immunodeficiencies which were treated by gene therapy, to diseases which are more frequent, like hemophilia, like drepanocytosis. And that's the point I was willing to make with this slide. Next slide, please. The point is that if we look at a series of gene therapies which are approved, which are on the market, and you know the prices, the very high tag prices of those treatments, and I'm sure that you know the prices in Canada are very similar to the one on this slide. The point I would like to make is there is really no relation between the number of eligible patients for these therapies and their cost. And I think that there we already have an important argument to say that indeed it's the market size is probably not the main factor explaining these very high prices for gene therapies. Next slide, please. Now, as you know, there are other explanations, the manufacturing cost, and that's true. I mean, those costs are significant. Another argument that we often hear is that, you know, these treatments are of unprecedented value and they could be given for just once and then you are cured for your life. So let me challenge this a bit. First, the unprecedented value. We already talked, and I really appreciate that the previous speaker also alluded to the impact of COVID-19 on health economics in general, I would say. So we have now this vaccine which seems extremely efficient. Obviously, they will clearly change completely all the burden linked to COVID-19, including obviously the economic burden. So, you know, if you consider the economic impact of a successful vaccination campaign, you could argue that the price of these vaccines, even if they are fully reimbursed for the government, should be extremely high. Actually, they will probably be rather high. We can discuss this further, but certainly not for all vaccine. And as you know, AstraZeneca, for example, to give this example, has a clear commitment to go for rather low prices, around $4 or $5 a dose. The other argument, one-time cure. So this is an argument that we often discuss with Alain Fischer, and he would tell you, and gene therapy specialist experts know this very well, that for a number of rare disease currently treated with approved therapies, we still don't know precisely if indeed this is a one-time cure. You know, very often the trials leading to approval and reimbursements are done on few patients, and usually the approval are done after a relatively short period of time. So these arguments, you know, we can say that it can be challenged. I already discussed the market size, and now I would like to come to another argument, which is the cost of research and development of these sophisticated therapies. Next slide, please. So in this interesting study, and there are others of the same type, authors look at the original discoveries leading to, you know, a number of drugs approved by FDA between 2008 and 2017. And the important point here is that several of those drugs actually originate in R&D supported by public money, by public funds. And this is the case for therapy which target rare diseases. And actually, there are interesting examples that I will not discuss. For example, treatment for cystic fibrosis, because you know that those treatments also raise important problems today in terms of pricing. So, next slide, please. So I think that's a key element. The fact that taxpayer money, in many cases, play an essential role in the initial discoveries, in the very early step of development of those therapies. Now, how do you value this? That's not an easy question. It's a question which has been raised when the first anti-HIV drugs were developed. And under, I would say, the pressure of HIV activists, and you remember at the time that there were really tough discussions and movements challenging the prices for the first anti-HIV drugs. And actually this movement, as you know, was quite efficient. So one of the achievements of these movements was to obtain that the US government introduce, and with the collaboration with the NIH, the so-called NIH reasonable pricing clauses. So what does it mean? It means that all academic institutions receiving NIH grants were obliged to introduce, when they negotiate their licensing agreement with other company, they had to introduce a reasonable pricing clause, which was not that binding, but at least it was there, and it could be used later on if really prices look completely out of unreasonable. And probably that this clause was still quite efficient, because there has been an impressive lobbying action from the industry to withdraw this clause, and they were successful. Under the Reagan administration, this clause was eventually indeed withdrawn. And we think that now is the time, and we will come back to this at the end, to perhaps think again about the possibility to introduce this type of clause in licensing agreement. Obviously, it will be important that this clause remain active through the life cycle of the new therapies, because, as you know, usually the first licensing agreement will be with biotech, eventually small biotechs, and it's important that when the biotech is acquired by a large pharma, for example, this clause still survive the acquisition by the big pharma. Now, this is important, but not easy to implement, as you can imagine. And we have an example. You all know the story of the Zolgensma in my country, in Belgium. You know, we had a number of cases where parents of children with SMA were organizing a crowdfunding to get the money required by the company to treat their child. And interestingly enough, Zolgensma had to, and Novartis, who was marketing Zolgensma, has to negotiate a licensing agreement with the Geneton in France, because they use a technology which was protected by a Geneton license. And I had the opportunity to discuss with the executive director of the Geneton, and this was quite illuminating. And because she explained me, you know, these were extremely tough discussions, because we have in our regulation at Geneton that indeed when we give a license, there is like a reasonable pricing clause. So they discussed for months with Novartis to get this clause, you know, considered and accepted by Novartis. It was extremely difficult, and at the very end, they just succeed that this clause would apply for the drug marketed in France, but not in other countries, which I think illustrate another element, is that companies are global, whereas we negotiate country by country. And even in Europe, I can tell you that we are far from having a coordinated negotiation power between the European member states and the companies. And I will come back to this at the very end. Next slide, please. Now, the previous one. Yeah, next one. Okay. Okay. So, as you know, the popular vision now to go around is let's pay for performance. So I already discussed the limitation of this concept using COVID-19 vaccines and possibly treatment as an example. But still, it's an interesting concept, and to have value-based agreement or outcome-based contract, that's certainly a step forward. And actually, it's probably necessary, but it's not sufficient. And the next slide, please. I think that this slide is perhaps one of the most important of this short presentation. Is from this Institute for Clinical and Economic Review in the US. And in this document, you will find, and I will go slowly about this, that the value of a treatment, one is it has been established according to some of the principles indicated on the previous slide. They should actually reflect the maximum price that our society might be prepared to pay for it. It didn't say that this should be the price. And that is very important when we think that what we are facing is indeed the need to find a trade-off between rewarding the innovator and also the manufacturer with a price to or equal to the value, to provide incentive for innovation, but at the same time you want to make sure that you ensure access to the treatment. The problem is that you might think that competition might be the process by which some regulation will work. But especially in the case of gene therapy, this doesn't really work. Why? Because there is concretely, in fact, very few competition in this field. Once you have a product, it's quite rare. This might change with some indication, with a larger market, but certainly in the first rare disease for which gene therapies were developed, there was almost no competition. Next slide, please. So the consequence, which was very well discussed by Peter Bach, is this anchoring effect, which is based on a theory by an economist who got the Nobel Prize, Daniel Kahneman. And this anchoring effect means that once you have a price for a product, it fixes the norm for, the successor, the product which come next. And that's really a problem that we are facing in gene therapies, as it was illustrated in one of my first slides. Next slide, please. So what can we do to go around and to achieve indeed reasonable prices? And we will come back to what could be the definition of a reasonable price later. I think that the first principle, and this is under debate right now, at least in Europe, about the price of COVID-19 vaccine, is transparency. And interestingly enough, the WHO adopts a clear resolution on the need to be transparent of most of the on all the process related to drug development, including pricing. This WHO resolution has been the subject of a huge debate, and finally the resolution was not really binding, but at least the concept is there. Now, this has been discussed at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and I think that the statement they made that transparency is more complicated than it seems is true, because obviously transparency may to some extent jeopardize the competition and may indeed lead to increased price instead of the opposite. Because obviously when you compare prices between countries, then the problem might start. Next slide. Now, what I did so far is just to explain different elements which are themselves explaining the problems we are facing with these high prices. Now you can say, anyway, those diseases are rare, so if you consider the whole budget, it might not be tragic. However, as we just said, it set the policy, and also now we have gene therapies which are not so rare, so that the burden for the healthcare budget might still be quite significant. Now, let's try to define what could be a reasonable price. Obviously, this would be a price for which you cover the real costs, you cover the manufacturing, the production, the cost of the distribution, some costs related to marketing, but as you know, there is a problem there, because when you look at the money spent on marketing until recently by a company, it was quite impressive. But okay, let's say that you have to cover this, and also you need to have at the end a benefit, so that there should be a profit margin. Now, when you look, and this was done, is regularly done by Forbes. This is a rather old slide, but the situation didn't really change over the years. When you look at the average profit margin of industrial sectors, as you know, pharmaceuticals are really high at the level of banks. And I think that this is an important figure, because I think that we could, and I think that companies should realize that when we ask some efforts in terms of reducing some prices, it is based on figures like this one. Next slide, please. Now, there is hope. When you look over the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years, there have been a number of statements, publication, press coverage, saying, okay, look, all these companies are now really changing. They realize that they have societal duties, that they are not only there to please their shareholders, and this was the topic of this issue of The Economist. Next slide. There's been several statements by top CEOs really taking some commitment. Look at this Business Roundtable statement This is not so long time ago. We commit to generate value for all our stakeholders, which means not only our shareholders, but also our other stakeholders, which means in healthcare, patients, and healthcare payers, of course. Next slide. This is another statement by this value balancing alliance, and this has been joined, as you see, by some pharma companies, including Novartis, as you can see here. And you know, the aims of the alliance is really to shift the priority for profit maximization to optimizing value creation, to standardize calculation, ensure comparability of methods, to increase transparency, to work with external bodies to develop and extend an accounting framework. So those are nice statements. Next slide. The concern is, how do you translate these nice, generous statements into actions? And that's more complicated for a number of reasons, and this was discussed in the paper that we wrote together with Alain Fischer and Mathias de Watripon in Nature Medicine last year. And we suggest there that to implement the benefit corporation concept, the benefit corporation certification might be a way forward by entering a legal protection to companies which indeed add social and environmental performance indicators as, in addition to value for shareholders. And indeed, there is a process for certification of benefit corporation status by an external body. Some companies are engaged in that. There is one pharma company, which is Chiesi. To my knowledge, this is the only one which is engaged in a process of B Corporation certification. Our suggestion is indeed that for these therapies which are so special, so costly, payers could consider that the reimbursement rate would be linked to the fact that the manufacturer is indeed a B Corporation, and we say B Corp certified manufacturer. And we think that this might be a way forward to consider, although there are a number of questions related to how do you certify the B Corporation status. Next slide, please. This will be my last slide, which indeed indicate that to define a fair pricing is really a challenge. There are a number of considerations. We alluded to some of them in this presentation. And the value of the treatment, obviously the investment made by the manufacturer, and the need to provide incentive for innovation, but also to consider the public investment, the importance to end up with affordable therapies, and this concept of market consistent profit margin that I just introduced. So my last statement would be the following. Don't take me wrong. I think that we should not, I would say, support pharma bashing. I think that to support pharma bashing is counterproductive. First, I think in pharma companies you have wonderful people at different levels. It's true that you have also people who are just there to please the shareholders, but we should be careful. They are wonderful scientists. There are excellent CEOs who have this vision of their societal mission. So I think that what we should do is work more on the public side. And, we were talking about public-private partnerships, and we are talking about negotiating prices, as health payers with the company. And it's there that I think that we should be much more stronger. We know that companies are there. We can try to have them implementing some changes according to their recent statements. That's one side. But on the other side, I think that we should be much more strict and not always accept what the companies are proposing as starting point in the negotiations. So I will stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to take any question.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Goldman. A very interesting presentation. So we do have some questions, and we'll start with questions from the audience. So the first question is a question about how you can have market competition when these gene therapies are targeting very small populations related to rare genetic diseases. Do you have any thoughts around that?
No, that's an excellent question. And as you know better than I do, there are even these single treatment which were developed for a single patient, actually, with some success. And no, I would just use this as an argument to say that competition cannot be the driver of to determine prices. Very often we say that we need both collaboration between public and private sectors, and we need competition. It's true, but I think that in this case, it's true that we must be careful in terms of competition. I think that I tried to emphasize this during my talk.
Okay, I have a question somewhat related to that. Is as gene therapies evolve, there may be gene therapies coming down the pipe that will be targeting common diseases, for instance, or more common diseases like heart failure, using similar gene approaches. So how does that change the calculation in terms of funding? As you showed earlier, there isn't a good relation between the size of the population and the cost. Would that be also the case as you go further up that curve?
Well, I hope it will help. I didn't allude to the question of CAR T-cell prices. And by the way, I think it's very important that, the top scientists working on this, and I heard Michael Sadlin saying, okay, I'm a scientist and I don't want to discuss so much about the prices. I think that we need people like him to indeed discuss the prices, and it's a bit what Alain Fischer is trying to do in Europe. I think that the problem of the CAR T cells is really interesting because, as you know, again, better than I do, those treatments are shown to be active in many, and will be active in many cancers. So we can say that using the usual market rules, the prices will go down. And that's exactly what, many people are saying. They say, okay, don't worry, it will work because there will be more, so the price will go down. But what do you do today with our prices, with our patients? And that's something very important, because very, very often those treatments start to be used in patients before they are approved, before they are even marketed. And this create an additional layer of inequalities. You know, people are desperately looking for institutions. They go abroad to get a treatment which proved to be efficient, let's say in phase 2 trials or during a phase 3. So we know that they will wait. It will be necessary to wait for approval and for marketing. And you know, when you talk about this terrifying disease in children or cancer patients, you can just not wait. So it's true that with some targeted disease becoming more common, we might hope that prices will go down, but I think that we should be proactive there and really start to the negotiations upfront. Yeah, that would be, I would say, my answer.
Okay, thank you. This is a question about the anchor effect. Do you have any ideas about how to incentivize the development of products with better outcomes that cost less?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. We have to reflect on this, but you know, I think that, you know, very often, at least in some companies, you know, it's just the opportunity. They look at what their competitor can get from a treatment, and they say, okay, there is no reason that I cannot get the same or even more, and it's there that I think that some departments in some companies are, you know, extremely good. And you know, this is the type of attitude we must in the public sector be ready to counteract. And I can tell you, and I don't know what's the situation in Canada, you know, in Europe we have a big debate around remdesivir and the way remdesivir was, you know, got this special exemption, and that it is used indeed in patient, whereas, as you know, probably at least the WHO doesn't recommend it. And you know, it's interesting, this story, because I can tell you that even some physicians were extremely well influenced by the company. So even now today, some physicians say, yeah, still. So it means that, you know, companies use a number of tricks to really influence pricing. And it is really this type of attitude for which we must be extremely conscious. We should be conscious, and we should be able to, to take appropriate actions, I would say.